My parents demanded I sign my house over to my unemployed sister because she has kids and I do not. They brought a realtor, a transfer deed, and even moved her furniture into my garage without asking. When I refused, my mother slapped me across the face, and my father publicly cut me out of his will right on my front lawn. I did not cry. I just smiled. 5 days later, they were calling me 146 times a day, begging for mercy. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how they all came to regret their actions. Growing up in Atlanta, our family projected an image of absolute perfection. My mother, Yvonne, practically ran our church community, always dressed in pristine suits and judging anyone who fell short of her standards. My father, Jerome, wielded his supposed $3 million estate like a weapon demanding total obedience. I am Aliyah, and at 34 years old, I am the family disappointment simply because my skin is darker, my career path did not match their vision, and I am proudly single without children. They thought I was just a lowly receptionist at a property management company. They had no idea I was the silent founder and majority shareholder of Vanguard Asset Holdings, a highly successful private equity and real estate firm. My illusion of a peaceful Tuesday evening shattered the moment I turned my car onto my street in Midtown Atlanta. My home is a beautiful modern Victorian property that I worked relentlessly to purchase. I value my privacy and my peace above all else. But as I pulled up to my driveway, my heart hammered against my ribs. A massive moving truck was parked right on my manicured front lawn, crushing the grass I had just paid to have landscaped. Standing by the open garage door was my white brother-in-law, Trevor. He was wearing his usual arrogant smirk, loudly directing two movers who were carrying my sister Monique's tacky floral sofas directly into my garage. Monique stood nearby, scrolling on her phone while her 3 children ran around my yard screaming and pulling up my flower beds. I put my car in park and stepped out, my hands shaking with a mixture of shock and immediate fury. Before I could even ask what was going on, my mother Yvonne marched out from my own front door. She had used the spare key she swore she would only keep for emergencies. In her hand, she held a thick manila envelope. She marched down the porch steps and shoved a legal document directly against my chest. "Sign it right now, Aaliyah," she demanded, her voice carrying that familiar tone of absolute authority she used at church meetings. Trevor's crypto investments took a hit, and their landlord evicted them this morning. Monique has 3 babies. You are 34 years old, single with no kids. You hoarding a huge 5-bedroom house all to yourself is exactly why God has not blessed you with a husband. I stared at the document. It was a quitclaim deed, transferring the property rights of my home. The sheer audacity paralyzed me for exactly 1 second. This was the golden child dynamic playing out in real time. Monique, my 29-year-old sister, who had never held a job for more than 3 months, was once again being rescued at my expense. I took a deep breath, pushing down the lifelong urge to shrink under my mother's glare. I pushed the paper back toward her. "I already told you no when you hinted at this last week, Mom. I am not giving up my home." "You are being entirely selfish," my mother snapped, stepping closer so she was entirely in my personal space. "This is family. We make sacrifices for family." I looked past her to where Monique was now watching us, arms crossed and looking incredibly entitled. "A sacrifice," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You mean like when you forced me to empty my entire college savings account to pay for Monique's legal fees when she got that drunk driving charge 10 years ago? You said she needed a clean record to marry well. I paid her debt and worked night shifts to pay for my own tuition. The answer is no. Get off my property." Before my mother could scream at me again, Trevor walked over. He had that insufferable, condescending posture he always used around me. He treated our entire family like we were lucky to have him just because he drove a leased sports car and talked loudly about blockchain. "Come on, Aaliyah," Trevor said, chuckling as if I were a stubborn child. He waved over a man in a cheap suit holding a briefcase. "This is Derek, my realtor. He brought his notary stamp to make it all official. You just answer phones for a living anyway. You cannot afford the property taxes in this neighborhood much longer. Be a good auntie and hand over the keys. We are already moving the stuff in, so let us not make this difficult." I looked at Trevor, then at the sleazy realtor standing on my driveway ready to steal my house. They truly believed I was a struggling secretary who would just fold under pressure. They thought they could bully me out of a $1.5 million asset because they viewed me as the weak link in the family. They were so blinded by their own greed and my mother's favoritism that they never bothered to ask how a receptionist could afford to live in Midtown Atlanta. I reached out and gently took the quitclaim deed from Derek the realtor. For a brief second, my mother and Trevor smiled, thinking I was finally submitting to their demands. Instead, I gripped the top of the document and ripped it straight down the middle. Then I tore it again, dropping the shredded pieces of paper directly onto Trevor's expensive shoes. "Get your garbage out of my garage," I commanded, my voice echoing down the quiet street. "Get this moving truck off my grass. If all of you are not off my property in 2 minutes, I am calling the police and pressing charges for trespassing and breaking and entering." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Monique's children stopped running around, sensing the massive shift in the atmosphere. The neighborhood felt entirely still as my family stared at me in pure disbelief. I had never spoken to them with such defiance. I had always been the quiet one, the one who took the insults and swallowed the pain. But standing on my own driveway, looking at the people who had used me my entire life, I felt nothing but power. The time for being the obedient scapegoat was officially over. I held the thick parchment paper in my hands. The heat of the Georgia evening seemed to press down on us, but my blood ran completely cold. Derek, the so-called realtor, actually had a pen extended toward me. His hand was trembling slightly, perhaps sensing the shift in the air that my family was too arrogant to notice. I did not take the pen. Instead, I gripped the top edge of the quitclaim deed. The sound of thick paper tearing down the middle echoed loudly in the quiet neighborhood. I tore it again, then a third time, letting the pieces flutter down onto Trevor's pristine white sneakers. Trevor's face flushed a violent shade of red. He took a step forward, his chest puffed out, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. But I did not flinch. "I told you to get this truck off my property," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "You are not moving in here today, tomorrow, or any day in the foreseeable future." That was the exact moment my sister decided to play her trump card. Monique let out a loud, theatrical wail that caused two of my neighbors across the street to stop watering their lawns. She dropped to her knees on my driveway, burying her face in her hands. "How can you be so evil?" she screamed, ensuring her voice carried all the way down the block. "I am your own flesh and blood. My babies are going to be sleeping on the street tonight because their aunt cares more about empty bedrooms than her own nieces and nephews." Her 3 kids, sensing their mother's manufactured distress, immediately began crying loudly. It was a flawless performance, the exact same routine she used when we were teenagers. Whenever she stole my clothes, wrecked my car, or spent the money I saved from my high school job, the tears would flow and I would be painted as the villain for daring to hold her accountable. My mother Yvonne rushed to Monique's side, wrapping her arms around her golden child. She glared up at me, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it took my breath away. "You are a monster!" she spat, her voice shaking with righteous fury. "The devil has truly taken hold of your heart. I raised you in the church, Aaliyah. I taught you to share your blessings. But you are just a bitter, selfish woman punishing your sister because she has the family you could never get." I looked down at my mother, refusing to break eye contact. "The only thing I am punishing her for is believing she is entitled to the fruits of my labor," I replied calmly. "And frankly, considering she married a man who cannot even keep a roof over her head, she is the last person who should be giving me relationship advice." The words had barely left my mouth before my mother lunged upward. Her hand struck my face with a sickening crack. The force of the slap snapped my head to the side. My ear rang and the metallic taste of blood bloomed on my bottom lip where my teeth had caught the skin. The entire driveway went dead silent. Even the kids stopped crying. I slowly turned my head back to look at her. My father Jerome marched up the driveway, his face tight with anger. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. "Do not you dare look at your mother that way," he bellowed. "You pushed her to it with your disrespect. You are a disgrace to the Washington name. We came here giving you a chance to do the right thing, to act like a real family. But if you do not let your sister move her things into this house right now, you are done." He puffed out his chest, using the ultimate weapon he had wielded over us since childhood. "I will call my lawyer tomorrow morning." He threatened, his voice booming for the whole neighborhood to hear. "I will cut you out of the family trust entirely. You will not see a single dime of my $3 million estate. I will leave every penny to Monique and the kids. You will be dead to me." He expected me to beg. He expected me to crumble to my knees and apologize for disrespecting his authority, terrified of losing out on his precious wealth. Instead, I reached up and gently touched my stinging cheek. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I looked at the three of them standing on my driveway, like tyrants who had just realized their kingdom was made of sand. "Keep your imaginary millions, Jerome," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "From this second forward, I have no family." I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed 911, putting the phone on speaker for them to hear. "Yes, I need officers at my address immediately," I said loudly and clearly. "I have several individuals trespassing on my property, one of whom just physically assaulted me. They have a moving truck blocking my driveway, and they are refusing to leave." Panic instantly replaced the arrogant fury on their faces. The fake realtor Derek grabbed his briefcase and sprinted toward his car without a backward glance. Trevor's eyes widened in sheer terror. He was already drowning in legal trouble, and the last thing he needed was police showing up to question why he was trying to forge property documents. "Get in the truck!" Trevor hissed at Monique, grabbing her by the arm and dragging her toward the passenger side. My parents scrambled toward their luxury sedan, their pristine church-going image completely abandoned as they fled like common criminals. As Trevor climbed into the driver's seat of the moving truck, he glared down at me through the open window. It was a look of pure, unadulterated venom, a silent promise that this was far from over. I just smiled back at him, watching them speed away, just as the distant sound of police sirens began to echo through the neighborhood. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my bedroom, painting the hardwood floors in warm light. It was a beautiful, quiet Sunday morning in Midtown Atlanta, but my phone was vibrating so aggressively it was slowly inching across the nightstand. I picked it up and saw the screen flooded with notifications. There were over 50 missed calls and a seemingly endless list of voicemails. My mother, Yvonne, had not wasted a single second. She had gone straight to the early morning service at our prominent Atlanta church to launch her smear campaign. I sat on the edge of my bed holding my cup of coffee and began playing the messages one by one. The first voicemail was from the pastor's wife. Her voice dripped with that specific brand of condescending pity reserved for church gossip. She told me she was praying heavily for my troubled soul. Yvonne had apparently cornered her before the sermon, weeping uncontrollably. My mother had spun a masterful and entirely fictional narrative. She told the church leadership that I was having a severe mental breakdown. She claimed I was viciously hoarding a massive house I did not need and was actively throwing my infant nieces and nephews out onto the cold street. To make the story even more dramatic, Yvonne added a fabricated detail that I was trying to sell the family property to a strange, dangerous man just to leave them all homeless. The messages that followed grew progressively more hostile. Church elders who had known me since I was in Sunday school left aggressive voicemails condemning my selfishness. They demanded I repent and honor my parents. But the most venomous message came from my Aunt Beatrice. Her voice was shrill and tight with lifelong judgment. She told me I always was a bitter girl. She said just because I was too dark-skinned and career-obsessed to get a man did not mean I had the right to punish my sister. She claimed Monique was blessed with a family, and that my barren jealousy was turning me into a monster. I listened to the entire message without blinking. I let the recording end, and the silence returned to my bedroom. Any other daughter might have broken down in tears at the sheer weight of a coordinated family attack, but I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating calm. I deleted the voicemails and set my phone face down. I did not reply to a single message. I did not draft an angry defense on social media or call my aunt to argue. Defending myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me was an absolute waste of my time. Instead, I walked down the hall to my home office and opened my laptop. I logged into the secure encrypted database of Vanguard Asset Holdings. My family and their church congregation thought I was a fragile, bitter receptionist throwing a tantrum. They could not possibly comprehend that I had the intelligence and resources of a $200 million private equity firm at my fingertips. I bypassed my usual corporate reports and pulled up the public and semi-public financial records for my brother-in-law, Trevor. My family revered Trevor because he was white, wore expensive suits, and threw around empty buzzwords about cryptocurrency and real estate flipping. They thought he was a financial genius who was going to elevate the family name and bring them incredible wealth. I knew men exactly like Trevor. I destroyed men like Trevor in corporate boardrooms every single week. It only took me 15 minutes of digging through property records, LLC filings, and digital wallets to find exactly what I was looking for. What I found made a genuine chilling smile spread across my face. Trevor had been playing an incredibly dangerous game. He had leveraged his position as the golden son-in-law to act as an unofficial investment advisor for several of the wealthiest elders in my mother's church. He had convinced them to trust him with their retirement funds, promising massive guaranteed returns through exclusive crypto investments. But the blockchain ledger does not lie, and forensic accounting is my specialty. I traced the digital footprints and saw exactly where the church elders' money had gone. Trevor had not invested their funds into any legitimate portfolios. He had diverted hundreds of thousands of dollars into a failing offshore crypto wallet to cover his own massive debts and fund his fake luxury lifestyle. The money was completely gone, and Trevor was drowning. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair and opened the church live stream on my iPad. The choir was just finishing their opening hymn, and the main Sunday announcements were about to begin. The camera panned over the congregation, and I saw my mother sitting in the very front row. Her arm was draped protectively around Monique, who was dabbing her eyes with a tissue, playing the perfect victim. Trevor sat right beside them, looking incredibly smug and pious, in a tailored suit paid for by stolen money. He had absolutely no idea his entire house of cards was about to collapse. I opened a new browser window and created an anonymous, untraceable email address. I attached the screenshots of the wire transfers, the offshore wallet addresses, and the undeniable proof of the completely drained crypto accounts. I compiled a clear, simple document showing exactly how Trevor had defrauded the church elders of their life savings. I added no personal commentary or emotional pleas. The financial numbers spoke entirely for themselves. With a steady hand, I sent the email directly to the church finance committee, the head pastor, and every single elder on the board. I leaned back and took another sip of my coffee, watching the live stream on my screen, waiting for the digital notifications to hit their phones right in the middle of the Sunday service. The Sunday morning sun warmed the outdoor patio of my favorite local coffee shop. I ordered a vanilla latte and found a quiet corner table away from the main walkway. The air smelled of roasted beans and fresh pastries. I sat back in my chair and opened my tablet. I did not look at the angry voicemails still sitting in my phone. I simply pulled up the live video feed from my parents' church. It was a massive, affluent congregation where image was everything, and my mother Yvonne treated the front pew like it was her personal throne. On my screen, the church sanctuary looked magnificent. The choir had just finished their opening songs, and the congregation was taking their seats. The camera panned across the front rows, and there they were. My mother was wearing a pristine peach-colored suit, her head held high as she patted Monique on the shoulder. Monique was holding her youngest child, playing the role of the devoted, struggling mother to absolute perfection. Sitting right beside them was Trevor. He wore a sharp navy blue suit and a smug expression, looking incredibly confident for a man who had just tried to steal my house the night before. My mother was leaning over and whispering to the women next to her, undoubtedly spreading more venomous lies about my supposed mental breakdown. I took a slow sip of my coffee and waited. I knew exactly what was sitting in the email inboxes of the church finance committee. The head pastor walked up to the heavy wooden podium to deliver the morning announcements. Usually, he possessed a booming, joyful voice that energized the massive room. Today, however, he looked completely different. His face was visibly pale and he was sweating. He gripped the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles were turning white. He did not smile. He did not offer his usual morning greeting. Instead, he leaned into the microphone and his voice trembled. He announced that there was an urgent and deeply troubling matter that required the immediate attention of the church elders and the finance committee. He asked several prominent men in the congregation to quietly step out into the hallway. But it was already too late for quiet conversations. I watched the live feed closely. I could see people in the pews checking their phones. The anonymous email I sent had not just gone to the pastor. It had gone to every single elder on the board, and those elders were already showing the email to their wives and friends. The information was spreading through the sanctuary faster than a wildfire. The email contained undeniable forensic proof. It showed the exact wire transfers, the specific routing numbers, and the digital receipts, proving that Trevor had been systematically draining the retirement accounts of several wealthy church members. He had promised them exclusive cryptocurrency portfolios with massive guaranteed returns. Instead, he had diverted every single dollar into a failing offshore wallet to fund his own fake luxury lifestyle and cover his massive debts. The blockchain records I attached were perfectly clear and completely legally binding. On my screen, the atmosphere in the church shifted violently. The polite silence of the morning service completely dissolved into angry murmurs. People were no longer looking at the pastor. They were turning their heads and staring directly at the front row. They were staring at Trevor. I watched my mother Yvonne as the realization hit her. The woman sitting next to her abruptly stood up and moved to another row, shooting my mother a look of absolute disgust. Yvonne's proud, confident posture completely collapsed. Her mouth fell open in horror as she looked around the massive room. Dozens of people were pointing and glaring at her golden family. Some of the men who had invested their life savings with Trevor were standing up, their faces red with fury. The entire smear campaign my mother had orchestrated against me evaporated in an instant. Nobody in that building cared about Aaliyah supposedly being a bitter, jealous woman throwing her sister out on the street. They only cared that the white son-in-law Yvonne had paraded around as a financial genius had just robbed them blind. Trevor's smug expression vanished entirely. He looked around the sanctuary like a cornered animal. He realized he was surrounded by wealthy, powerful men whose money he had completely squandered. He did not stay to comfort his crying wife. He did not stay to protect his mother-in-law. Trevor simply stood up, pushed past Monique without a word, and practically ran down the side aisle toward the exit, leaving his family to face the wrath of the congregation entirely alone. I smiled, taking another slow sip of my vanilla latte. The coffee tasted absolutely incredible. I closed the church live stream feeling a deep, profound sense of peace. I had not yelled. I had not defended myself. I had simply let the truth do my work for me. I was just about to pack up my tablet and order a pastry when my cell phone vibrated sharply against the metal table. It was not a phone call or an angry text from my mother. It was a high-priority alert from my home security system. I opened the security application and tapped on the live camera feed from my front porch. My heart rate stayed perfectly steady, but my eyes narrowed. A white commercial van was parked in my driveway. A man wearing a tool belt was standing on my front porch, holding a heavy-duty drill directly against the lock of my custom front door. He was a locksmith, and standing right next to him looking over his shoulder nervously was Trevor. He had sped straight from the church to my house. He was breaking in. I grabbed my purse and practically flew out of the coffee shop. The drive back to Midtown took exactly 12 minutes, but my mind was racing the entire time. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had underestimated their sheer desperation. I assumed exposing Trevor to the church elders would force them to retreat and deal with the fallout. Instead, the impending collapse of his financial fraud had pushed Trevor into full-blown panic mode. He needed an asset he could liquidate immediately, and my $1.5 million house was his only target. I pulled onto my street and saw my front door standing wide open. The white commercial van was gone. The locksmith had done his job and left. I parked my car in the driveway and walked up the front steps. Wood splinters littered the welcome mat. The deadbolt had been completely drilled out, leaving a jagged metal hole in the heavy oak door. I stepped inside the foyer and the sound of my sister laughing drifted down the staircase. It was not a nervous laugh. It was the loud, entitled laugh of a woman who genuinely believed she had just won the lottery. I walked up the hardwood stairs, making no effort to hide my footsteps. The door to my master bedroom was wide open. I stood in the doorway and took in the scene playing out in my personal sanctuary. Trevor had dragged 3 large suitcases onto my custom area rug. Monique was standing in front of my expensive vanity mirror. She had already pushed my expensive perfumes aside and was casually unpacking her cheap makeup bags, lining her items up on my marble countertop. She was actually humming a gospel song we used to sing in the church choir. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" I asked, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. Monique jumped slightly and spun around. For a split second, I saw genuine fear in her eyes, but it was immediately replaced by a deeply arrogant smirk. She turned back to the mirror and picked up a lipstick tube. "We are moving in, Aaliyah," she said casually, as if she were simply commenting on the weather. "Mom called us right after church. She said you completely lost your mind and started screaming at people during the service. She told us to get over here immediately before you try to burn the place down." "I did not go to church today, Monique," I replied, stepping into the room. "And you are trespassing. Get out of my house before I have you physically dragged out." Trevor walked out of my walk-in closet holding a stack of his shirts. He did not look scared anymore. He looked incredibly pleased with himself. "You cannot drag us out, Aaliyah," he said, tossing his clothes onto my bed. We looked it up. Mom said since we are legally your immediate family, we have squatter rights if we just get our belongings inside the property. It is a civil matter now. You cannot just kick family out onto the street. Plus, I already took care of the paperwork, so you do not need to worry your pretty little head about it. The sheer stupidity of their plan was almost difficult to comprehend. They actually believed that breaking into a house and claiming squatter rights would legally entitle them to a luxury property. They were banking on the fact that I would be too embarrassed by a public family dispute to actually call the police. They thought I would just surrender my master bedroom and move down the hall rather than cause a scene in my affluent neighborhood. "You broke my lock," I said, staring directly at Trevor. "You hired a locksmith under false pretenses to bypass a security system on a property you do not own. That is breaking and entering. That is a felony." Monique rolled her eyes and applied her lipstick. "Stop acting like a lawyer, Aaliyah. You answer phones all day. You do not know anything about the law. Mom said you are legally obligated to help us because Trevor is going through a temporary financial setback. We are taking the master bedroom because we have 3 kids and we need the space. You can move your stuff into the guest room downstairs. Be grateful we are letting you stay here at all." I did not argue with her. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed the local police precinct directly. I did not call the emergency line. I called the direct desk number of a lieutenant I knew personally from previous property disputes in the area. I requested 2 cruisers to my address immediately for an active home invasion. When I hung up the phone, Monique actually laughed. "Go ahead and call the cops," she taunted, turning around to face me. "Let them come. They cannot do anything to us." Trevor smiled and patted his chest pocket. We stood in silence for the next 10 minutes. I watched them unpack their belongings into my drawers. I felt absolutely no sadness that my sister was doing this to me. The betrayal had already happened years ago. This was just the final pathetic manifestation of their greed. When the flashing blue and red lights finally illuminated my bedroom window, I walked downstairs to open the front door. 2 police cruisers were parked on the street. 4 officers walked up my driveway, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. I met them on the porch and quickly explained the situation. I told them my sister and her husband had hired a locksmith to drill my deadbolt while I was out and were currently unpacking their bags in my bedroom. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, nodded and followed me inside. We walked up the stairs together. I fully expected the officers to put Trevor and Monique in handcuffs the moment we entered the room. I wanted to see the arrogance wiped completely off their faces. But Trevor did not panic when the police walked into the bedroom. He did not raise his hands or offer any excuses. He confidently walked right up to the lead officer and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment paper. "There seems to be a huge misunderstanding," Officer Trevor said using his most charming professional voice. "My sister-in-law here has been having some severe mental health episodes lately. Her mother can verify this. We are just trying to move in to help take care of her." The officer frowned. "Sir, you cannot just break into someone else's home regardless of their health status. The homeowner wants you removed from the premises immediately." "I am the homeowner," Trevor replied smoothly. He handed the folded document to the lead officer. I watched the officer unfold the paper, and his eyes scanned the text. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The officer lowered the document and looked at me with a deep, uncomfortable frown. He let out a heavy sigh and handed the paper back to Trevor. Then he turned to face me. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice losing all of its previous warmth. "This gentleman has a notarized quitclaim deed transferring this entire property into his name. It is legally stamped and dated, and it appears to be signed by you yesterday evening. I am afraid this is no longer a trespassing issue. This is a civil matter, and I cannot force him to leave his own property." I stood frozen in the center of my bedroom. I stared at the piece of paper in Trevor's hand. It was the exact same quitclaim deed my mother had tried to force me to sign on the driveway the night before, the one I had ripped into pieces. But this document was perfectly intact, and right at the bottom on the designated signature line was a flawless exact replica of my personal signature alongside the official stamp of Derek the fake notary. Trevor had forged my name to steal my house. Trevor stood right behind the tall officer, and a slow, sickening smirk spread across his face. He puffed out his chest, looking entirely too pleased with his manufactured victory. "See, Officer Trevor," said, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "Aaliyah changed her mind last night. She signed the paperwork in front of my realtor, Derek. We are the legal owners now, and we just want to get our family settled." The officer turned back to me. His expression hardened into a mask of pure authority. He folded the forged document and handed it back to Trevor. "Mom," the officer said, looking me up and down, "I am going to have to ask you to vacate the premises. This gentleman has the deed, and until a judge says otherwise, he has the legal right to occupy this property. You need to gather your belongings and leave." Monique let out a loud, sharp laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of my bedroom. She turned away from the vanity mirror and leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms. "You heard the officer?" "Aaliyah," my sister sneered, "it is time for you to pack a bag and get out of our house. Maybe you can go sleep in your little cubicle at work since you love your secretarial job so much. Mom was right about you. You really do not know how to handle your own affairs." I did not yell. I did not scream or throw a tantrum the way they desperately wanted me to. I remained absolutely still in the center of the room, letting the silence stretch out until it became deeply uncomfortable for everyone except me. I slowly reached into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out my cell phone. I did not break eye contact with Trevor as I dialed a direct encrypted line and pressed the speaker button. The phone rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered the call. "Harrison," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any panic. "It is Aaliyah. I need you down at the Midtown property immediately. Bring the federal response team. Someone just committed title fraud and federal wire fraud against the firm." Trevor let out a loud, condescending chuckle. He shook his head and looked at the police officer, rolling his eyes. "What firm?" Aaliyah, Trevor mocked, stepping closer to me. "You are a secretary. You answer telephones for a living. Stop playing these ridiculous games and get out of my house before I have you arrested for trespassing." I slowly lowered the phone and looked dead into Trevor's eyes. The smug amusement on his face began to waver just a fraction as he registered the absolute coldness in my stare. I took one deliberate step toward him. "I do not own this house, Trevor. I said, my words cutting through the air like a knife. I never did. This house is owned by Vanguard Asset Holdings, LLC. You did not forge my personal signature. You forged the signature of a corporate entity worth $200 million. Trevor's face instantly drained of all its color. His skin turned a sickly shade of gray, and his mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked down at the piece of parchment paper in his trembling hand, as if it had suddenly caught fire. He knew exactly what Vanguard Asset Holdings was. Every amateur crypto investor and real estate flipper in the city knew the name of the most ruthless private equity firm in Atlanta. He just never possessed the intelligence to connect the dots between the massive corporate entity and the sister-in-law he thought was a simple receptionist. Monique stopped laughing. She pushed herself off the doorframe, her eyes darting frantically between me and her husband. "Trevor? What is she talking about?" My sister demanded, her voice pitching up into a hysterical squeak. "Tell them she is lying. Tell them this is our house." Trevor could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with sheer, unfiltered terror. He realized in that exact moment that his entire life was completely over. The church fraud, the forged real estate documents, the breaking and entering, it was all crashing down on his head at exactly the same time. The lead police officer frowned deeply and placed his hand on his radio. "Mom, what exactly are you saying?" the officer asked, his tone shifting from authoritative to extremely cautious. "I am saying that this man just handed you a document containing a forged signature, attempting to steal a commercial property," I explained smoothly. "I am the senior managing partner of Vanguard Asset Holdings." Trevor thought he was stealing a residential home from his little sister. He actually just committed a Class A federal felony against a heavily guarded corporate asset. And Harrison, the man on the phone, is our lead corporate attorney. He is currently dispatching federal investigators to this exact address. The forged deed slipped from Trevor's fingers and fluttered onto the custom area rug. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grab the edge of my bed to stop himself from collapsing. The police officers in the room exchanged a dark, knowing look. The lead officer stepped forward and placed his hand firmly on Trevor's shoulder, completely trapping him inside the bedroom. "Sir," the officer said, his voice dangerously low, "I am going to need you to step away from the bed and keep your hands exactly where I can see them. Do not make a single sudden movement." Monique began to scream. It was not her usual manufactured theatrical wail designed to gain sympathy. It was a genuine, piercing scream of absolute panic. She lunged toward Trevor, but the second officer quickly stepped into her path, blocking her from reaching him. "You cannot do this to us!" Monique shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "We are family, Aaliyah. You are supposed to help us. Mom is going to destroy you for this." I just looked at her as the police officers pulled out their handcuffs. "Mom does not have any power here, Monique," I said calmly. "And neither do you." Exactly 15 minutes later, a sleek black town car pulled into my driveway, blocking Trevor's moving truck perfectly. Harrison stepped out of the vehicle looking every bit the ruthless corporate lawyer he was born to be. He did not knock or wait for an invitation. He walked straight through my shattered front door and marched up the hardwood stairs. He carried a thick leather briefcase, and his cell phone was pressed tightly to his ear. The police officers tensed, placing their hands on their duty belts as he entered the bedroom, but Harrison simply flashed his state bar credentials. He walked past Trevor and handed his phone directly to the lead officer. "The district attorney would like a word with you," Harrison said, his voice perfectly smooth and entirely devoid of warmth. The lead officer took the phone and stepped out into the hallway. While he was gone, Harrison opened his briefcase and laid the original Vanguard Asset Holdings formation documents across my unmade bed. He pulled out the corporate charter, the operating agreement, and the incredibly strict legal protocols required for transferring any asset owned by the firm. The documents showed that transferring the property required 3 board signatures, a corporate seal, and a highly verified legal process. Trevor's single sheet of forged paper looked like a pathetic child's art project in comparison. When the lead officer walked back into the room, his entire demeanor had shifted completely. He looked at Trevor, not as a disgruntled family member involved in a civil domestic dispute, but as a serious criminal suspect. The officer explained that he had just spoken directly with the district attorney. He stated clearly that this was no longer a simple family matter. Because the property was owned by a massive corporate entity, Trevor's actions constituted high-level corporate fraud. Furthermore, Harrison pointed out the ink stamp from Derek, the fake realtor. The officer inspected the stamp and confirmed that impersonating a notary public to transfer real estate elevated the crime to a state felony. Trevor began to visibly shake. He tried to take a step backward, but his legs gave out and he slumped heavily against the wall. The second officer grabbed Trevor by the arms, spun him around, and slammed his hands behind his back. The sharp click of the metal handcuffs echoing in the quiet room was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Trevor sobbed openly, begging the officers to let him go. He claimed he had no idea what he was doing, and that it was all just a big misunderstanding driven by his financial stress. That was when Monique completely lost her mind. She saw her golden ticket to wealth and status being dragged away in chains, and she panicked. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, utilizing the exact same theatrical tears she always used to manipulate our parents. She wailed that her husband was an innocent man being unfairly targeted. She screamed that the police were corrupt and that they were ruining a good Christian family who just needed a place to stay. She fully expected her loud performance to force everyone to back down, just like it always did when we were growing up. But the police officers simply ignored her and continued reading Trevor his rights. Realizing her tears were completely ineffective, Monique's manufactured grief turned into pure explosive rage. Her face turned a violent shade of purple. "You did this to us, you evil witch!" she shrieked, staring at me with pure hatred. Before anyone could react, Monique lunged across the bedroom directly at me. Her hands were curled into claws aiming straight for my face. She never even made it halfway. The lead officer stepped smoothly into her path, catching her by the shoulders. Monique thrashed and kicked, screaming that she was a mother and demanding they let her go. She actually tried to slap the officer in her blind fury. That was her ultimate mistake. The officer swiftly twisted her arms behind her back and forced her face down onto my mattress. He pulled out a second pair of handcuffs and secured her wrists tightly. He informed Monique she was under arrest for assaulting a police officer and for being a willing accessory to federal wire fraud and property theft. My sister was hyperventilating as the officers hoisted her to her feet. Her pristine makeup was smeared all over her face, and her designer clothes were rumpled and ruined. The officers began marching both of them out of the bedroom and down the staircase. I followed closely behind Harrison, walking silently beside me. I watched the two people who had tormented me for years finally face the severe legal consequences of their own arrogance. As the officers shoved them into the back of the waiting police cruisers, Monique pressed her tear-stained face against the glass window. The officer rolled it down slightly so he could close the door properly. Aaliyah Monique screamed, her voice raw and completely desperate. "Call Mom and Dad! Call them right now! They will get their lawyers to fix this! You have to call them!" I stood on my front porch, wrapping my cardigan tightly around myself against the cool morning air. I looked down at my sister trapped in the back of a police car with her fraudulent husband facing years in a federal prison. "Oh, I will call them," I said, my voice carrying perfectly over the sound of the idling police engines. "But not to help you." The drive to the downtown precinct was quiet and incredibly peaceful. I sat in the passenger seat of the town car watching the city streets roll by while Harrison made a series of rapid-fire phone calls. He was ensuring the district attorney was personally overseeing the charges and that no local judge would grant them an immediate release. We arrived at the station and were escorted directly to a private room away from the main holding area. I spent the next 2 hours drinking bad coffee and giving a meticulously detailed statement to a federal investigator and a local detective. I provided them with the original property deed, the LLC formation documents, and a complete timeline of my family and their escalating harassment. Every single lie they had ever told, every manipulation, and every threat was documented and handed over to the authorities. I was just signing the final page of my witness statement when the heavy double doors of the precinct waiting area flew open. Even from deep inside the glass-walled interview room, I could hear the familiar sound of my mother screaming. I stood up and walked out into the main bullpen with Harrison right behind me. Jerome and Yvonne had arrived, and they were absolutely hysterical. My mother was clutching her designer handbag like a weapon, while my father was aggressively pointing his finger at a desk sergeant demanding to speak to whoever was in charge. Yvonne spotted me stepping out of the interview room, and her face contorted with pure, unfiltered rage. She shoved her way past a uniform officer and marched directly toward me, her heels clicking loudly against the linoleum floor. "Aaliyah, what have you done?" My mother shrieked, her voice echoing off the concrete walls of the police station. "You need to march right back in there and drop these ridiculous charges immediately. They are taking Trevor to county lockup. They put your sister in a holding cell like a common criminal. Who is going to watch my grandbabies while their parents are in jail?" I did not flinch. I did not shrink away from her anger the way I had for the past 30 years. I stood my ground and looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was completely worthless. I thought about all the holidays she had ruined, all the times she had called me a failure, and all the moments she had chosen my sister over me. "You watch them, Yvonne," I replied, my voice echoing in the quiet precinct. "You are remarkably good at raising brats. Just look at how Monique turned out." My mother gasped and physically recoiled, placing her hand over her chest as if I had just struck her. She looked at my father with wide, tear-filled eyes, completely expecting him to step in and put me in my place. Jerome puffed out his chest and marched over to join her. His face was bright red, and he was breathing heavily, clearly trying to summon all the patriarchal authority he had used to terrorize me since childhood. He thought he still held the ultimate trump card. He genuinely believed he still possessed the power to bring me to my knees. "Ah, Leah, this is your last warning," my father growled, pointing a trembling finger inches from my face. "You have humiliated this family for the last time. If you do not walk back in there right now and tell the police this was all just a huge misunderstanding, I will go to my lawyer tomorrow morning. I will completely liquidate my $3 million estate. I will give every single penny to charity before I ever let you see a dime of my money." He stood there breathing hard, looking incredibly proud of himself. He thought the threat of losing my inheritance would instantly break my resolve. He thought I was still that desperate young girl begging for her father's financial approval and validation. He assumed money was the only language I understood because it was the only language he had ever spoken. Harrison, who had been standing silently by the doorframe reading a text on his phone, slowly looked up. He slipped his phone into his suit pocket and looked at my father. He did not look angry or intimidated. He looked at Jerome with pure, unadulterated pity. He tilted his head slightly, observing my father, the way one might look at a confused animal before turning his gaze to me. I let out a soft, genuine chuckle that seemed to confuse my parents even more than my defiance. The threat of disinheritance was so hollow and pathetic, it was almost comical. I crossed my arms and looked directly into my father's angry eyes, watching the false bravado mask his deep-seated insecurities. "Jerome," I said slowly, savoring every single syllable, "you have not had $3 million in 5 years." I left them standing there in the middle of the precinct waiting area. My father's mouth was hanging open, and my mother looked like she had just seen a ghost. Harrison fell into step beside me as we walked out the double-glass doors and into the bright afternoon sunlight. I did not look back. I climbed into the back of the waiting town car and told the driver to take us to the office. The drive to the financial district gave me time to let the adrenaline fade and the cold calculation take over. My family had spent my entire life treating me like an incompetent failure while they paraded around pretending to be local royalty. They mocked my career choices and dismissed my intelligence because I refused to play their shallow social games. They had no idea what I had actually been building while they were busy maxing out credit cards to maintain an illusion. The car pulled up to a towering glass skyscraper in the heart of downtown Atlanta. I walked through the revolving doors and the security guards immediately nodded in respect. We took the private elevator straight to the top floor where the heavy mahogany doors of Vanguard Asset Holdings opened to reveal my actual world. The penthouse level was a hive of controlled chaos and high-level corporate strategy. Sleek glass walls overlooked the entire city skyline. Junior analysts and senior portfolio managers moved quickly through the open floor plan carrying tablets and thick financial dossiers. When I stepped onto the floor, the ambient noise lowered slightly out of respect. I was not a secretary answering phones. I was the senior managing partner of a firm that managed billions in private equity. I had built this empire from the ground up, utilizing every ounce of business acumen my father claimed I lacked. I walked directly into my corner office and dropped my purse onto the custom marble desk. Harrison followed me inside and closed the door. I pressed the intercom button and summoned my lead financial analyst, Marcus. He appeared less than a minute later, holding his encrypted tablet and looking ready for orders. I need a complete forensic dive into a specific portfolio, I told Marcus, leaning back in my leather chair. I want every bank account, every line of credit, every mortgage, and every hidden debt attached to Jerome and Yvonne. I want to know exactly how much it costs to fund their delusions of grandeur. Marcus nodded and immediately went to work. He did not ask questions about why we were investigating my parents. At Vanguard, we specialized in hostile takeovers and aggressive asset acquisition. Digging into the financial skeletons of wealthy individuals was exactly what we did best. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing quarterly reports and authorizing international wire transfers while I waited. I felt absolutely no guilt about looking into my parents' finances. They had just tried to use their imaginary wealth to blackmail me into dropping federal charges against a man who tried to steal my property. They had drawn the battle lines, and I was simply gathering my ammunition. Marcus knocked softly and entered my office carrying a thick manila folder. He did not look triumphant. He actually looked slightly disturbed by what he had found. He placed the folder on my desk and opened it to the first page. "You were right about their liquidity," Marcus said, pointing to a spreadsheet filled with red numbers. "Your father has not had $3 million in liquid assets for over half a decade. Their outward lifestyle is entirely funded by high-interest debt and severely leveraged assets." I scanned the documents tracing the path of my parents' financial ruin. It was all laid out in undeniable black and white. They were paying thousands of dollars a month just to maintain their exclusive country club membership. They were leasing luxury vehicles they could not afford just to impress their neighbors. And the largest drain on their accounts was a constant steady stream of cash transfers directly to Monique and Trevor. My parents were literally bankrupting themselves to fund my sister's fake perfect life. "They are drowning," I said quietly, tracing the negative balances with my pen. "They are one missed payment away from total foreclosure." Marcus cleared his throat and shifted his weight uncomfortably. "That is not the worst part, boss," he said, sliding a specific document out from the back of the folder. "We dug into the property records for their primary estate. 14 months ago, someone took out a $1.5 million secondary mortgage against the house." I frowned, staring at the loan application. My father was arrogant and financially irresponsible, but he was incredibly protective of his primary estate. He constantly bragged that he owned the house free and clear. He never would have leveraged his most prized asset for a cash loan. "Who authorized this?" I asked, my eyes scanning the digital signature at the bottom of the page. "That is what caught my attention," Marcus explained, tapping the signature block. "The loan was processed entirely online through an obscure secondary lender that does not require in-person verification. The funds were immediately diverted into a series of offshore holding accounts. We traced the digital footprint of the application." Marcus paused and looked at me with a grim expression. "The digital signature on that $1.5 million loan application belongs to an IP address registered to Trevor." I sat back in my chair and stared at the name on the screen. The sheer audacity of it was almost difficult to process. Trevor had not just tried to steal my house today. He had secretly stolen my parents' house over a year ago. My father was at the police station threatening to cut me out of an inheritance that no longer existed, while the man he was desperately trying to protect had already robbed him blind. I stared at the glowing tablet screen as the pieces of the puzzle violently snapped into place. Trevor did not just run a fake ministry at his church to scam the congregation. He had systematically drained my parents of their entire net worth to fund his disastrous cryptocurrency investments. Marcus pulled up the supporting legal documents and pointed to the bottom of the page. Trevor had manufactured a completely fraudulent power of attorney. He had used the exact same fake notary stamp that he tried to use on my property today. He legally bound my parents to a massive secondary mortgage and then funneled the cash directly into his offshore crypto wallets. The sheer scale of his betrayal was almost impressive in its complete lack of morality. Marcus tapped the screen again and brought up a notice of default from SunTrust Bank. The situation was actually much worse than simply having zero liquid assets. Trevor had completely stopped making payments on that massive loan exactly 6 months ago. The bank was actively processing the foreclosure on my parents' estate. The paperwork had already been filed in the county court system. Within the next 30 days, the bank would officially seize the property and lock my parents out of the only home they had ever known. My mother and father were currently standing in a police precinct, screaming at officers and demanding the release of the man who had just destroyed their entire lives. They had no idea they were about to be completely homeless. They genuinely still believed Trevor was a financial genius who was simply experiencing a temporary setback. They thought their $3 million legacy was safe and secure in the hands of their favorite son-in-law. I sat alone in my quiet office as Marcus discreetly stepped out to give me a moment of privacy. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline below. I could easily pick up the phone right now and call my father. I could send him the documents and give him a 30-day head start to hire a bankruptcy lawyer and try to salvage some fraction of his dignity. I could warn them about the impending foreclosure and save them the ultimate public humiliation of being forcibly evicted by county sheriffs. I slowly raised my hand and touched my cheek. It still throbbed slightly from where my mother had slapped me years ago when I refused to give Monique my college savings. I closed my eyes and let 15 years of memories wash over me. I remembered every single time they called me ugly. I remembered them telling me I was completely unlovable because I cared more about reading financial reports than finding a rich husband. I remembered every holiday dinner where my mother announced to the extended family that I was her greatest disappointment. They had built their entire identities on making me feel completely worthless while elevating Monique and Trevor onto an untouchable pedestal. I opened my eyes and lowered my hand. The lingering sense of familial obligation completely evaporated from my chest, leaving nothing behind but cold business calculation. They wanted to worship Trevor, and they wanted to despise me. I was simply going to let them experience the natural consequences of their own choices. I reached across my marble desk and pressed the intercom button to connect directly with my acquisitions department. A director answered immediately, awaiting my instructions. "Contact the Commercial Debt Division at SunTrust Bank." I said, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any emotion. "Vanguard Asset Holdings wants to purchase a specific package of distressed debt. I am sending you the parcel number right now. I want to buy the debt tied directly to my parents' address, and I want the foreclosure rights transferred to my name by the end of the business day." The director of my acquisitions department moved with ruthless efficiency. Within 4 hours, the commercial debt division at SunTrust Bank had processed the transaction. Banks despise holding onto toxic, non-performing loans, and they were absolutely thrilled to offload Trevor's fraudulent mortgage at a steep discount. Vanguard Asset Holdings swallowed the debt whole. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the digital ink was dry, and the paperwork was filed with the county clerk. I was now legally the primary debt holder of the sprawling suburban mansion my parents valued more than their own flesh and blood. While I was meticulously dismantling their financial foundation, my family was busy drowning in their own delusions. Through my private security team, I learned that Trevor was already out on bail. Jerome had desperately pawned a significant portion of Yvonne's antique jewelry collection just to secure the cash needed for the federal bondsman. The moment Trevor walked free from county lockup, he immediately began spinning an elaborate web of absolute lies to save his own skin. He told my parents and my hysterical sister that I was a psychotic liar who had orchestrated a massive conspiracy to frame him. He boldly claimed that I had hacked into his personal computer to forge the real estate documents, and that the federal agents who arrested him were corrupt officials I had personally bribed. It was an incredibly ridiculous story, full of gaping holes and logical impossibilities. But my parents swallowed every single word of it without hesitation. Their absolute refusal to admit they were wrong blinded them to the devastating reality of their situation. They needed Trevor to be the victim because the alternative was admitting that they had worshipped a con artist while discarding their only successful child. 2 days later, my receptionist knocked on my office door and handed me a thick envelope that had arrived via certified mail. I opened it to find a formal cease and desist letter drafted by a cheap strip mall attorney Jerome had apparently scraped together enough pennies to hire. I read through the document and actually laughed out loud at the sheer audacity of the text. The letter demanded that I immediately cease all contact with the family and drop all federal charges against Trevor. But the final paragraph was the absolute pinnacle of entitlement. The cheap lawyer formally demanded that I hand over the complete deed to my downtown townhouse as direct emotional compensation for the severe distress and public humiliation I had maliciously caused Monique and her innocent husband. They genuinely believed they could bully me into giving them my home to apologize for defending myself against their theft. They still thought they held the power. They still thought I was the weak, unwanted daughter who would eventually cave to their demands. I tossed the pathetic letter into the trash can next to my desk, just as Marcus walked back into my office. He placed a heavy leather-bound folder directly in front of me. It contained the final authenticated bank transfers and the official assignment of the mortgage. Vanguard Asset Holdings officially owned the debt, and the foreclosure rights were entirely mine. There was no more waiting periods, and no more bank bureaucracy to navigate. I picked up my heavy gold fountain pen and deliberately signed my name across the final line of the transfer documents. The scratch of the nib against the thick paper was the sound of ultimate closure. I closed the folder and handed it back to Marcus, looking up at him with a perfectly calm expression. Draft a notice of immediate foreclosure and total property eviction. I told him, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. And coordinate with our private process servers. I want the final eviction notice served directly to their dining room table, right in the middle of their precious Sunday dinner. Saturday morning arrived with a toxic explosion of social media activity. My mother had apparently spent the entire night crafting a massive online campaign against me. I sat in my home office sipping my coffee while scrolling through Yvonne's relentless Facebook posts. She wrote long, dramatic paragraphs about how God always protects his favored children. She painted Trevor and Monique as innocent martyrs who were being ruthlessly persecuted by a jealous barren sister. She explicitly stated that I was trying to destroy a beautiful family simply because I was bitter and alone. The comment section was a complete nightmare. Extended family members, aunts, uncles, and cousins I had not seen in years were openly attacking me. They called me a traitor to my own blood. They wrote that putting my own sister in the back of a police cruiser was an unforgivable sin and that I should be deeply ashamed of myself. The entire narrative had been completely flipped against me, just like my mother had always done when we were children. She knew exactly how to play the victim, and she was using her church friends and our relatives as a weapon to destroy my reputation. Then the ultimate insult appeared on my timeline. Trevor posted a live video directly to his public profile. He was lounging by the edge of Jerome's massive backyard pool wearing expensive sunglasses and smoking a thick Cuban cigar. He looked incredibly smug and completely relaxed. He did not look like a man who was out on a federal bail bond funded by pawned jewelry. He looked directly into the camera and blew a cloud of smoke into the air. He laughed and told his followers that the haters were just jealous of his massive success. He boldly claimed that he was completely untouchable and that his cryptocurrency investments were about to pay off big time. He promised his followers that he was about to secure generational wealth and that minor setbacks were just part of the journey to the top. My parents and my sister were commenting on the video, praising his business genius and sending him heart emojis. They were celebrating a false victory built on a foundation of absolute lies. I watched the video play on a loop, listening to the sound of Trevor's arrogant laughter echoing from my phone speaker. I did not feel angry or defensive. I simply reached across my desk and looked at the digital clock on my computer monitor. It was exactly 10 in the morning. Trevor thought he had outsmarted me because he managed to bond out of a local county jail. He had completely forgotten about the forged notary stamp he used to illegally transfer corporate assets across state lines. I smiled and took another sip of my coffee, watching the seconds tick by on my screen. Because right at this very moment, a team of heavily armed federal authorities were kicking down the doors of Trevor's fake downtown investment office. Sunday morning arrived, and Trevor's arrogant hubris was finally completely shattered. I found out exactly how the morning unfolded because the federal lead investigator called my cell phone to give me a courtesy update. While I was sitting in my penthouse enjoying the quiet peace of a new day, my parents were completely losing their minds in the suburbs. Jerome and Yvonne were getting ready for their prestigious Sunday church service. They were dressing in their absolute finest designer clothes, preparing to parade Trevor and Monique around the congregation to prove that the recent legal troubles were just a minor misunderstanding. Trevor was standing in the grand foyer, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He was still riding high on his fake victory from the day before, still believing he was a completely untouchable financial mastermind. He genuinely thought his social media performance had solidified his innocence and proven his superiority. He was absolutely wrong. The crisp morning air of their exclusive gated community was suddenly shattered by the arrival of three black unmarked federal SUVs. Federal agents swarmed my parents' pristine manicured lawn, moving with intense tactical precision. They did not ring the doorbell or wait for a polite invitation. They pounded aggressively on the heavy oak double doors until Jerome finally opened them. My father stood there in his custom-tailored suit, completely paralyzed, as multiple federal agents flashed their badges and pushed their way directly into his home. They bypassed Jerome entirely and marched straight toward Trevor, who was suddenly frozen in place on the hardwood floor. The feds were not there for the local real estate fraud involving my house. The lead agent loudly announced the federal charges echoing off the marble walls of the entryway. Derek, the fake realtor and fraudulent notary, had completely flipped. He folded under a single hour of intense federal interrogation and handed over every single piece of evidence to save himself from a lengthy prison sentence. Derek provided the federal investigators with encrypted hard drives proving that Trevor had orchestrated a massive PPP loan fraud scheme during the height of the pandemic. The lead agent explained the absolute worst part to my stunned parents. Trevor had used the stolen identities and social security numbers of Yvonne, Jerome, and Monique to secure millions in fraudulent federal funds. He had secretly made my entire family complicit in a massive federal crime just to fund his fake cryptocurrency lifestyle. Trevor's arrogant smirk completely vanished. His face turned ghost white as his knees visibly buckled beneath his expensive suit pants. The federal agents did not show any mercy or respect for his supposed status. They grabbed his arms, twisted them harshly behind his back, and slammed him against the foyer wall. The heavy click of the steel handcuffs echoed through the silent house, signaling the absolute end of his pathetic charade. Yvonne began to hyperventilate. She rushed out onto the front porch, clutching her pearls, but she was not crying out of concern for her precious son-in-law. She looked frantically across the street and saw all of her wealthy neighbors standing on their manicured lawns, watching the entire spectacle unfold. The federal raid was completely destroying her pristine suburban reputation in real time. She shrieked and wailed about how her social standing was being ruined forever right in front of the country club president who lived next door. Jerome watched in absolute shock as federal agents dragged his golden son-in-law out the front door and shoved him into the back of a black federal SUV. The reality of the situation finally pierced through his massive ego. Federal charges meant federal prison. The family name was about to be dragged through the mud on national television, and their financial legacy was tied directly to a massive fraud operation. Jerome ran into his home office and frantically grabbed his phone. He was sweating profusely as he dialed the emergency weekend number for his private wealth manager at the bank. He aggressively demanded an immediate line of credit. He yelled into the receiver, stating he needed to pull a massive amount of equity from the estate right this second to hire the most expensive federal defense attorney in the state to fix this massive disaster. The bank teller paused on the other end of the line. The silence was incredibly heavy and absolute. Jerome tapped his expensive leather shoes against the floor, demanding an immediate answer and threatening to move his non-existent wealth to another institution. The teller finally spoke, and his voice was filled with a mixture of deep confusion and profound pity. "Sir, you do not have any equity in this property," the teller stated clearly. "In fact, your entire mortgage debt was sold to a private equity firm last week." Jerome stood perfectly still as the bank teller's words echoed through his spacious home office. The solid ground beneath his feet completely vanished, leaving him suspended in a terrifying freefall. He slammed the phone down onto his desk and frantically opened his laptop. His hands shook violently as he logged into his private banking portal. The screen loaded and the numbers stared back at him in cold, harsh black and white. His savings accounts were completely drained. His retirement funds had been leveraged to the absolute limit. But the most devastating detail was the massive negative balance attached to his property. There was a $1.5 million secondary mortgage taken out against the estate. The dates on the digital documents matched exactly with the timeline of Trevor's rapid business expansion. The horrifying truth finally pierced through Jerome's suffocating denial. Trevor did not just commit federal fraud with random business loans. The golden son-in-law had completely forged Jerome's signature. He had stolen the deed to their pristine suburban mansion and drained every single ounce of equity they had spent 40 years building. Jerome and Yvonne were entirely broke. They were worse than broke because they were now drowning in a massive mountain of fraudulent debt. Jerome stumbled out of his office and walked into the grand foyer where his wife and daughter were still weeping. Yvonne was sitting on the bottom step of the grand staircase, clutching her chest and gasping for air. Monique was pacing across the hardwood floor, wiping her mascara-stained face and wailing about how unfair the world was to her precious husband. Jerome looked at his daughter with a sudden sickening realization. He asked her directly, looking straight into her tear-filled eyes, if she knew about the massive loan taken out against their family home. Monique froze mid-step. Her loud theatrical sobbing stopped instantly. She looked away from her father and stared down at the expensive rug beneath her feet. The suffocating silence in the foyer was absolute confirmation. She finally broke down, but it was not out of guilt or remorse. Monique threw her hands in the air and admitted everything in a fit of defensive rage. She confessed that she knew Trevor took out the massive loan against her parents' estate. But she immediately justified it by screaming that Trevor was a visionary. She shrieked that he was going to double the money in Bitcoin and that it was supposed to be a brilliant surprise. She actually claimed they were doing her parents a favor by investing their stagnant equity into the future of digital currency. When Jerome stared at her in absolute horror, Monique doubled down on her delusion. The golden child suddenly turned her vicious anger directly onto her parents. She screamed that it was their fault for not having more liquid cash available to bail them out. She blamed her father for being too conservative with his wealth and told him that if he had just given Trevor the money willingly, none of this federal investigation would be happening. The flawless family unit completely shattered right there in the foyer. They viciously turned on each other like cornered animals. Jerome yelled at his daughter, calling her an ungrateful accomplice to a massive federal crime. Monique screamed right back, accusing her parents of being unsupportive and abandoning her in her time of need. Yvonne sat on the stairs, completely ignoring the fact that her daughter had just helped steal her entire life savings. Yvonne was hyperventilating solely because her pristine social image was officially dead. She rocked back and forth, wailing about her elite country club status. She cried about how she could never face the neighborhood association again and how her prestigious bridge club would permanently exile her. The loss of her money meant absolutely nothing compared to the devastating loss of her perceived superiority. They were all trapped in a toxic spiral of blame and social panic, completely unable to grasp the true severity of their situation. I listened to the live audio feed from my private investigators, completely fascinated by the sheer volume of their delusion. They were fighting about country club memberships, while federal agents were currently processing their son-in-law for massive federal fraud. Then the sharp chime of the front doorbell echoed through their chaotic house. The screaming instantly stopped. Yvonne gasped and clutched the stair railing, terrified that the neighborhood gossip committee had arrived to witness their downfall. Jerome smoothed his wrinkled suit jacket and marched toward the front door, desperately trying to regain some fraction of his authoritative presence. He opened the heavy oak doors, expecting to see another team of federal agents, or perhaps a concerned neighbor. Instead, a man in a plain gray polo shirt stood on the front porch holding a thick manila envelope. The man asked if he was speaking to Jerome, and when my father nodded, the man simply handed the envelope forward. "You have been officially served," the process server said, in a bored, monotone voice, before turning around and walking back down the long driveway. Jerome tore open the thick envelope right there on the front porch. His hands trembled as he pulled out the heavy stack of legal documents. He stared at the bold black lettering printed across the very top page. It was a formal notice of immediate foreclosure and total property eviction. He scanned the document, frantically looking for the name of the bank or the lending institution that had initiated the catastrophic process, but the bank was not listed. Jerome read the name of the sole creditor holding the entire debt of his beloved estate, and the remaining color completely drained from his face. The creditor listed at the very top of the legal notice was Vanguard Asset Holdings, LLC. It took Jerome exactly 3 hours of frantic phone calls to unmask the corporate veil of Vanguard Asset Holdings. I knew he would not stop digging until he found a name. He aggressively interrogated his private wealth managers and threatened local county clerks until someone finally pulled the corporate registration records. When my father discovered that his estranged daughter was the primary owner and chief executive officer of the private equity firm that now held his fraudulent debt, his panic mutated into a blinding, desperate rage. He could not comprehend that the quiet girl he had spent decades treating like an absolute failure had quietly accumulated enough wealth and power to hold the literal keys to his survival. My phone vibrated on the polished marble surface of my desk. I looked down at the glowing screen and saw a text message from my father. It was not a plea for mercy or a desperate apology for allowing Trevor to steal my identity and destroy our family. It was an arrogant command dripping with the exact same toxic entitlement he had weaponized against me my entire life. "Get to my house now," the text read. "I know what you did. We are going to fix this as a family before I take you to court." I read the words twice and let out a soft, cold laugh. His absolute delusion was almost fascinating to witness. He was currently drowning in millions of dollars of fraudulent debt, while his golden son-in-law was sitting in a federal holding cell, facing decades in prison. His entire social and financial empire was collapsing around him in real time. Yet he genuinely believed he still held the upper hand. He actually thought he could intimidate me with empty legal threats and bully me into surrendering my legally acquired assets just to save his precious reputation. He wanted a family meeting so he could demand my compliance. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the private dressing room attached to my office. For years, I had attended family dinners wearing quiet, unassuming clothes, just trying to blend into the background and avoid my mother's vicious critiques. I had constantly made myself small and insignificant to protect their fragile egos and maintain the illusion of family harmony. That version of me was completely dead and gone. I reached into my closet and pulled out my sharpest, most expensive tailored suit. It was a flawless charcoal gray design that screamed absolute authority and unapologetic power. I slipped into the silk-lined jacket and adjusted the lapels in the full-length mirror. I reached into my jewelry case and bypassed the delicate silver bracelets I normally wore. Instead, I pulled out a heavy gold Rolex and clasped it around my wrist. It was bold and aggressive, and it cost more than the luxury vehicles my sister loved to lease. I looked at my reflection and felt a profound sense of absolute clarity. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter desperate for a tiny scrap of parental validation. I was the executioner, and I was about to deliver the final devastating blow to their empire of lies. The drive to my parents' massive suburban neighborhood was entirely peaceful. I did not feel the usual knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. The towering iron gates of their exclusive community opened for me without hesitation, and I drove my car slowly down the pristine tree-lined streets. I pulled into their wide, circular driveway and parked directly behind my mother's immaculate luxury SUV. The massive estate loomed in front of me with its ostentatious white columns and perfectly manicured hedges. It was a monument to their vanity and a physical representation of every single lie they had ever told the world. I walked up the wide brick steps, but I did not reach for the heavy brass door knocker. I did not ring the doorbell to announce my arrival like a common invited guest. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out the old, tarnished brass key they had given me years ago. They had probably forgotten I even still possessed it. I slid the key into the lock, turned it with a satisfying click, and pushed the heavy oak doors open. The grand foyer was dead silent, but I could hear the tense, hushed voices coming from the formal dining room down the hall. I did not announce myself. I simply walked across the imported hardwood floors, my expensive heels clicking with a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed off the high ceilings. I stepped right into the dining room archway and stood there in perfect silence, watching as my entire family froze in their seats and turned to look at the woman who now owned their entire world. I stood at the head of the massive mahogany dining table looking down at the three people who had made my childhood a living nightmare. Jerome and Yvonne were seated frozen in their velvet-upholstered chairs, while Monique sat slumped over, crying into her hands. The remains of their extravagant Sunday breakfast sat completely untouched on fine china plates. No one moved or spoke for a long, tense moment, as the reality of my presence finally washed over them. Jerome was the first to break the silence, and his reaction was exactly as predictable as I knew it would be. His initial shock instantly melted into aggressive, arrogant fury. The idea that I was the one holding the ultimate power over his life was simply too much for his massive ego to process. He slammed his fist down onto the table, making the expensive crystal water glasses rattle violently. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and started yelling at me, as if I was still a terrified teenager living under his oppressive roof. He screamed that I was a vindictive monster who had deliberately tracked down and bought their debt just to humiliate them. He demanded that I stop standing over him and sit down right this second. He ordered me to transfer the deed of the house back to his name immediately without any further discussion. His face turned an unhealthy shade of purple as he dictated his terms, stating that I was going to use my corporate funds to pay for the absolute best federal defense lawyers in the country to save Trevor from a lengthy prison sentence. "You owe this family," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the formal dining room walls. "You owe us your absolute loyalty and your financial support." I did not flinch. I did not step back or lower my gaze. I looked at the man who had dismissed every single one of my accomplishments, and I let out a loud, genuine laugh. The sound of my laughter seemed to shock them more than my sudden arrival. The room went completely still as my amusement washed over their frantic desperation. "Owe you?" I asked, my voice echoing with icy calm authority. "Owe you for what exactly?" I paced slowly down the length of the table, forcing them to turn their heads and follow my movements. "Do I owe you for the time you told me I was too dark to wear a white dress to my own high school prom? Do I owe you for the time you made me pay full market rent the exact month I turned 16 just to teach me a harsh lesson about the real world, while Monique received a brand new luxury sports car just for maintaining a miserable C average?" Jerome opened his mouth to shout another command, but I stepped closer and cut him off instantly. I reminded him that while he was busy handing Trevor the absolute keys to his financial kingdom without performing a single basic background check, I was out in the real world building a corporate empire from the absolute ground up. I told him that my money belonged entirely to me and my firm, and I would rather burn every single dollar I possessed than spend a single dime saving the fraudulent criminal he eagerly chose over his own flesh and blood. Monique's theatrical sobbing suddenly grew much louder. She looked up at me with thick black mascara streaming down her flushed cheeks, expecting the exact same pity she had manipulated out of everyone her entire life. She opened her mouth to whine about her ruined future, but before she could speak, Yvonne abruptly pushed her heavy chair back and stood up. My mother smoothed the front of her expensive designer dress and desperately attempted to pull her shattered dignity together. She raised her chin, trying to project an air of superiority, and tried to play the ultimate matriarch card, hoping to guilt me into immediate submission. Aaliyah, your sister is about to be a single mother with a husband sitting in a federal prison, Yvonne pleaded, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation. We have absolutely no money left to save ourselves. Have some Christian mercy. I stared at my mother as her pathetic plea for mercy hung in the stagnant air of the dining room. I did not offer her a warm embrace or a shoulder to cry on. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy binder stamped with the Vanguard Asset Holdings logo. I lifted it high and dropped it flat onto the center of the mahogany table. The loud thud made Jerome physically jump in his seat. I looked directly into Yvonne's tear-filled eyes and told her that Christian mercy was the exact and only reason she was not currently sitting in a federal prison cell alongside her precious son-in-law. Yvonne gasped and grabbed the edge of the table. Jerome opened his mouth to object, but I slapped my hand onto the leather binder, cutting him off instantly. I explained every single horrifying detail of Trevor's massive PPP loan fraud scheme. I told them exactly how their golden boy had stolen their social security numbers to secure millions in illegal government funds. I explained that the federal investigators were completely ready to indict Jerome and Yvonne as active co-conspirators in a massive federal crime. The only reason the federal agents did not drag them out of their home in handcuffs was because my corporate attorneys had spent the last 48 hours buried in emergency legal meetings with the prosecution. My legal team had aggressively intervened and provided airtight digital proof that Jerome and Yvonne were simply the gullible victims of severe identity theft. I watched the blood completely drain from my parents' faces. They froze in absolute terror as the devastating reality finally crushed their massive egos. They had absolutely no idea how close they had actually come to losing their freedom and spending the rest of their lives wearing orange jumpsuits in a federal penitentiary. I turned my attention back to my father, who was now trembling uncontrollably in his velvet chair. I looked around the opulent dining room, taking in the imported crystal chandeliers and the ridiculous custom oil paintings that they cherished so much. I reminded Jerome of his absolute favorite threat. I reminded him of all the family dinners and birthdays he had spent arrogantly threatening to cut me out of his magnificent $3 million legacy. I leaned forward, resting both my hands on the table, and looked him dead in the eyes. You have no legacy left to protect Jerome, I said, my voice cold and unwavering. You let a smooth-talking con artist steal your entire life savings simply because he kissed your ass and gave you a false sense of superiority. You handed over your entire kingdom because you were too arrogant to look past a fake smile in a rented luxury car. I watched Jerome slump forward as the total destruction of his empire finally broke his spirit. The house was legally mine now. Every single brick and marble tile belonged exclusively to Vanguard Asset Holdings, and by extension, it belonged to the exact same daughter they had cast aside as a worthless failure. I reached into my briefcase one final time and pulled out a crisp white document. I slid the formal legal paper across the polished wood table until it rested directly against his trembling hands. I told him it was an official 48-hour eviction notice. I looked at the three of them sitting in the ruins of their fake, perfect life and informed my stunned family that they needed to pack whatever they could carry. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate my property, I stated clearly. I am bulldozing this entire pristine suburban mansion by the end of the week to build a complex of luxury condominiums. Jerome stood perfectly still as the bank teller's words echoed through his spacious home office. The solid ground beneath his feet completely vanished, leaving him suspended in a terrifying free fall. He slammed the phone down onto his desk and frantically opened his laptop. His hands shook violently as he logged into his private banking portal. The screen loaded and the numbers stared back at him in cold, harsh black and white. His savings accounts were completely drained. His retirement funds had been leveraged to the absolute limit. But the most devastating detail was the massive negative balance attached to his property. There was a $1.5 million secondary mortgage taken out against the estate. The dates on the digital documents matched exactly with the timeline of Trevor's rapid business expansion. The horrifying truth finally pierced through Jerome's suffocating denial. Trevor did not just commit federal fraud with random business loans. The Golden son-in-law had completely forged Jerome's signature. He had stolen the deed to their pristine suburban mansion and drained every single ounce of equity they had spent 40 years building. Jerome and Yvonne were entirely broke. They were worse than broke because they were now drowning in a massive mountain of fraudulent debt. Jerome stumbled out of his office and walked into the grand foyer where his wife and daughter were still weeping. Yvonne was sitting on the bottom step of the grand staircase, clutching her chest and gasping for air. Monique was pacing across the hardwood floor, wiping her mascara-stained face and wailing about how unfair the world was to her precious husband. Jerome looked at his daughter with a sudden, sickening realization. He asked her directly, looking straight into her tear-filled eyes, if she knew about the massive loan taken out against their family home. Monique froze mid-step. Her loud, theatrical sobbing stopped instantly. She looked away from her father and stared down at the expensive rug beneath her feet. The suffocating silence in the foyer was absolute confirmation. She finally broke down, but it was not out of guilt or remorse. Monique threw her hands in the air and admitted everything in a fit of defensive rage. She confessed that she knew Trevor took out the massive loan against her parents' estate, but she immediately justified it by screaming that Trevor was a visionary. She shrieked that he was going to double the money in Bitcoin and that it was supposed to be a brilliant surprise. She actually claimed they were doing her parents a favor by investing their stagnant equity into the future of digital currency. When Jerome stared at her in absolute horror, Monique doubled down on her delusion. The golden child suddenly turned her vicious anger directly onto her parents. She screamed that it was their fault for not having more liquid cash available to bail them out. She blamed her father for being too conservative with his wealth and told him that if he had just given Trevor the money willingly, none of this federal investigation would be happening. The flawless family unit completely shattered right there in the foyer. They viciously turned on each other like cornered animals. Jerome yelled at his daughter, calling her an ungrateful accomplice to a massive federal crime. Monique screamed right back, accusing her parents of being unsupportive and abandoning her in her time of need. Yvonne sat on the stairs, completely ignoring the fact that her daughter had just helped steal her entire life savings. Yvonne was hyperventilating solely because her pristine social image was officially dead. She rocked back and forth, wailing about her elite country club status. She cried about how she could never face the neighborhood association again and how her prestigious bridge club would permanently exile her. The loss of her money meant absolutely nothing compared to the devastating loss of her perceived superiority. They were all trapped in a toxic spiral of blame and social panic, completely unable to grasp the true severity of their situation. I listened to the live audio feed from my private investigators, completely fascinated by the sheer volume of their delusion. They were fighting about country club memberships while federal agents were currently processing their son-in-law for massive federal fraud. Then the sharp chime of the front doorbell echoed through their chaotic house. The screaming instantly stopped. Yvonne gasped and clutched the stair railing, terrified that the neighborhood gossip committee had arrived to witness their downfall. Jerome smoothed his wrinkled suit jacket and marched toward the front door, desperately trying to regain some fraction of his authoritative presence. He opened the heavy oak doors, expecting to see another team of federal agents or perhaps a concerned neighbor. Instead, a man in a plain gray polo shirt stood on the front porch, holding a thick manila envelope. The man asked if he was speaking to Jerome, and when my father nodded, the man simply handed the envelope forward. "You have been officially served," the process server said in a bored, monotone voice, before turning around and walking back down the long driveway. Jerome tore open the thick envelope right there on the front porch. His hands trembled as he pulled out the heavy stack of legal documents. He stared at the bold black lettering printed across the very top page. It was a formal notice of immediate foreclosure and total property eviction. He scanned the document frantically, looking for the name of the bank or the lending institution that had initiated the catastrophic process. But the bank was not listed. Jerome read the name of the sole creditor holding the entire debt of his beloved estate, and the remaining color completely drained from his face. The creditor listed at the very top of the legal notice was Vanguard Asset Holdings, LLC. It took Jerome exactly 3 hours of frantic phone calls to unmask the corporate veil of Vanguard Asset Holdings. I knew he would not stop digging until he found a name. He aggressively interrogated his private wealth managers and threatened local county clerks until someone finally pulled the corporate registration records. When my father discovered that his estranged daughter was the primary owner and chief executive officer of the private equity firm that now held his fraudulent debt, his panic mutated into a blinding, desperate rage. He could not comprehend that the quiet girl he had spent decades treating like an absolute failure had quietly accumulated enough wealth and power to hold the literal keys to his survival. My phone vibrated on the polished marble surface of my desk. I looked down at the glowing screen and saw a text message from my father. It was not a plea for mercy or a desperate apology for allowing Trevor to steal my identity and destroy our family. It was an arrogant command dripping with the exact same toxic entitlement he had weaponized against me my entire life. "Get to my house now," the text read. "I know what you did. We are going to fix this as a family before I take you to court." I read the words twice and let out a soft, cold laugh. His absolute delusion was almost fascinating to witness. He was currently drowning in millions of dollars of fraudulent debt, while his golden son-in-law was sitting in a federal holding cell facing decades in prison. His entire social and financial empire was collapsing around him in real time, yet he genuinely believed he still held the upper hand. He actually thought he could intimidate me with empty legal threats and bully me into surrendering my legally acquired assets just to save his precious reputation. He wanted a family meeting so he could demand my compliance. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the private dressing room attached to my office. For years, I had attended family dinners wearing quiet, unassuming clothes, just trying to blend into the background and avoid my mother's vicious critiques. I had constantly made myself small and insignificant to protect their fragile egos and maintain the illusion of family harmony. That version of me was completely dead and gone. I reached into my closet and pulled out my sharpest, most expensive tailored suit. It was a flawless charcoal gray design that screamed absolute authority and unapologetic power. I slipped into the silk-lined jacket and adjusted the lapels in the full-length mirror. I reached into my jewelry case and bypassed the delicate silver bracelets I normally wore. Instead, I pulled out a heavy gold Rolex and clasped it around my wrist. It was bold and aggressive, and it cost more than the luxury vehicles my sister loved to lease. I looked at my reflection and felt a profound sense of absolute clarity. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter desperate for a tiny scrap of parental validation. I was the executioner, and I was about to deliver the final devastating blow to their empire of lies. The drive to my parents' massive suburban neighborhood was entirely peaceful. I did not feel the usual knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. The towering iron gates of their exclusive community opened for me without hesitation, and I drove my car slowly down the pristine, tree-lined streets. I pulled into their wide circular driveway and parked directly behind my mother's immaculate luxury SUV. The massive estate loomed in front of me with its ostentatious white columns and perfectly manicured hedges. It was a monument to their vanity and a physical representation of every single lie they had ever told the world. I walked up the wide brick steps, but I did not reach for the heavy brass door knocker. I did not ring the doorbell to announce my arrival like a common invited guest. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out the old tarnished brass key they had given me years ago. They had probably forgotten I even still possessed it. I slid the key into the lock, turned it with a satisfying click, and pushed the heavy oak doors open. The grand foyer was dead silent, but I could hear the tense, hushed voices coming from the formal dining room down the hall. I did not announce myself. I simply walked across the imported hardwood floors, my expensive heels clicking with a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed off the high ceilings. I stepped right into the dining room archway and stood there in perfect silence, watching as my entire family froze in their seats and turned to look at the woman who now owned their entire world. I stood at the head of the massive mahogany dining table, looking down at the three people who had made my childhood a living nightmare. Jerome and Yvonne were seated frozen in their velvet-upholstered chairs, while Monique sat slumped over crying into her hands. The remains of their extravagant Sunday breakfast sat completely untouched on fine china plates. No one moved or spoke for a long, tense moment as the reality of my presence finally washed over them. Jerome was the first to break the silence, and his reaction was exactly as predictable as I knew it would be. His initial shock instantly melted into aggressive, arrogant fury. The idea that I was the one holding the ultimate power over his life was simply too much for his massive ego to process. He slammed his fists down onto the table, making the expensive crystal water glasses rattle violently. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and started yelling at me, as if I was still a terrified teenager living under his oppressive roof. He screamed that I was a vindictive monster who had deliberately tracked down and bought their debt just to humiliate them. He demanded that I stop standing over him and sit down right this second. He ordered me to transfer the deed of the house back to his name immediately, without any further discussion. His face turned an unhealthy shade of purple as he dictated his terms, stating that I was going to use my corporate funds to pay for the absolute best federal defense lawyers in the country to save Trevor from a lengthy prison sentence. "You owe this family," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the formal dining room walls. "You owe us your absolute loyalty and your financial support." I did not flinch. I did not step back or lower my gaze. I looked at the man who had dismissed every single one of my accomplishments, and I let out a loud, genuine laugh. The sound of my laughter seemed to shock them more than my sudden arrival. The room went completely still as my amusement washed over their frantic desperation. "Oh, you?" I asked, my voice echoing with icy calm authority. "Oh, you for what, exactly?" I paced slowly down the length of the table, forcing them to turn their heads and follow my movements. "Do I owe you for the time you told me I was too dark to wear a white dress to my own high school prom? Do I owe you for the time you made me pay full market rent the exact month I turned 16 just to teach me a harsh lesson about the real world, while Monique received a brand new luxury sports car just for maintaining a miserable C average?" Jerome opened his mouth to shout another command, but I stepped closer and cut him off instantly. I reminded him that while he was busy handing Trevor the absolute keys to his financial kingdom, without performing a single basic background check, I was out in the real world building a corporate empire from the absolute ground up. I told him that my money belonged entirely to me and my firm, and I would rather burn every single dollar I possessed than spend a single dime saving the fraudulent criminal he eagerly chose over his own flesh and blood. Monique's theatrical sobbing suddenly grew much louder. She looked up at me with thick black mascara streaming down her flushed cheeks, expecting the exact same pity she had manipulated out of everyone her entire life. She opened her mouth to whine about her ruined future, but before she could speak, Yvonne abruptly pushed her heavy chair back and stood up. My mother smoothed the front of her expensive designer dress and desperately attempted to pull her shattered dignity together. She raised her chin, trying to project an air of superiority, and tried to play the ultimate matriarch card, hoping to guilt me into immediate submission. "Alia, your sister is about to be a single mother with a husband sitting in a federal prison," Yvonne pleaded, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation. "We have absolutely no money left to save ourselves. Have some Christian mercy." The absolute finality of my next words hung in the stagnant air of the formal dining room like a physical weight. I watched the comprehension slowly try to register in their widened eyes. The concept of bulldozing their pristine suburban mansion was the ultimate violation of their sacred reality. This was not just a house to them. It was a monument to their vanity. It was the physical embodiment of their perceived superiority over everyone else in their social circle. The idea that it would be reduced to rubble and replaced by commercial condominiums completely short-circuited their brains. Total and complete devastation finally took hold. Yvonne shattered first. The perfectly styled matriarch who had spent her entire adult life curating a flawless image of wealthy suburban perfection literally crumbled to the floor. Her knees hit the expensive imported rug with a heavy thud. She did not care about her designer dress or her carefully arranged posture anymore. She crawled forward on her hands and knees until she was right at my feet. She reached out with trembling hands and desperately grabbed the hem of my tailored suit jacket. Her face was a smeared mess of expensive makeup and genuine terrifying panic. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes and started sobbing uncontrollably. The sound was harsh and guttural. It was the sound of a woman who had just realized she was stepping into an abyss. "Please, baby," she wailed, her voice cracking under the weight of her absolute desperation. "You are my daughter. You cannot do this to us. Where will we go? What about the grandbabies?" I looked down at the woman gripping my clothing. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no warmth in my chest and no residual childhood urge to comfort her. I simply stared at her tear-stained face and thought about all the times I had needed my mother. I thought about the times I had come to her for support or validation only to be met with cold, calculated disdain. I thought about how she had happily watched Trevor ruin my credit and steal my future just to protect her precious social standing. She only remembered I was her daughter when she needed me to be her savior. She only weaponized the concept of family when she had absolutely no other leverage left to use. Before I could even process a verbal response to her pathetic begging, the room erupted into a new layer of chaotic violence. Monique suddenly jumped out of her velvet chair like she had been physically burned. The golden child did not rush forward to comfort her weeping mother. She did not turn to me to plead for mercy on behalf of her children. Instead, she turned her vicious, suffocating terror entirely onto her own parents. Monique started screaming at the top of her lungs. Her voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers and the custom oil paintings. She pointed an aggressive, trembling finger at Jerome and blamed him for her entire destroyed future. She shrieked that he was a stupid, arrogant old man, forever trusting Trevor with the family estate. She accused him of being a gullible fool who handed over their entire financial safety net without doing a single basic background check. She yelled that he had doomed his own grandchildren to a life of poverty simply because he wanted to feel like a brilliant investor. She then turned her vicious rage onto Yvonne, who was still sobbing on the floor. Monique screamed that her mother was a shallow, useless woman who cared more about country club gossip than protecting her own family. She blamed Yvonne for constantly feeding Trevor's massive ego and making him believe he was an untouchable genius. The golden child was systematically tearing apart the exact same people who had spent decades placing her on an impossible pedestal. They had shielded her from every single consequence her entire life, and now that the ultimate consequence had finally arrived, she was sacrificing them without a second of hesitation. I shifted my gaze from the screaming sister to the broken father. Jerome was still sitting in his chair at the head of the long dining table, but he was no longer the imposing patriarch who ruled through intimidation and financial control. He looked like he had physically aged 20 years in the span of 20 seconds. His broad shoulders were completely slumped. His face had turned a pale, sickly shade of gray, and his breathing was shallow and uneven. The proud, arrogant man who had spent his entire life building an empire of false superiority was completely gone. His pride was permanently broken. He stared blankly at the formal eviction notice resting on the table in front of him. He could not look at his screaming daughter. He could not look at his weeping wife crawling on the floor. Most importantly, he could not look at me. The realization that his entire worldview was fundamentally wrong had crushed him from the inside out. He had believed that wealth and status made him invincible. He had believed that treating me like a worthless outsider was somehow a reflection of his own greatness. Now the exact daughter he had discarded was standing over the ruins of his life, holding the deed to his most prized possession. I gently stepped back, pulling the hem of my jacket out of Yvonne's desperate grip. She let out a pathetic wail and slumped forward onto the rug, completely defeated. The chaotic screaming from Monique faded into background noise as I focused my attention entirely on the woman sobbing at my feet. The time for anger and resentment had passed. This was the moment of absolute clinical execution. I looked down at my mother and kept my voice perfectly level. The quiet authority in my tone easily cut through the hysterical noise filling the dining room. I reminded her of the last time she had visited my home. I reminded her of the condescending smirk on her face when she walked through my property and judged every single aspect of my life. "You told me my house was too big for someone without kids." I said, my words dropping like heavy stones onto the quiet marble floor. I let the memory hang in the air, ensuring she heard every single syllable. I watched her shoulders shake as the reality of my statement settled over her. "Well," I continued, my voice devoid of any pity or hesitation, "you are about to have a lot of kids living with you in whatever cramped two-bedroom apartment you can manage to afford on your monthly Social Security checks." I looked from Yvonne on the floor over to Monique, who had suddenly stopped screaming and was staring at me in absolute horror. "Enjoy your golden child," I added quietly. Hilda. There was nothing left to say. There was no grand emotional speech needed to finalize their destruction. The reality of their situation was far more devastating than any insult I could ever hurl at them. They had built a fragile house of cards based entirely on lies, manipulation, and extreme entitlement. I had simply removed the bottom card and let the entire structure collapse onto their heads. I turned my back on the three of them. I did not look at Jerome staring blankly at the eviction notice. I did not look at Monique hyperventilating about her ruined future. I did not look at Yvonne weeping on the imported rug. I simply picked up my leather briefcase, adjusted my tailored suit jacket, and began walking toward the grand foyer. My expensive heels clicked against the hardwood floors with a steady, rhythmic cadence. With every step I took, the suffocating weight of my childhood grew lighter and lighter. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of that house no longer held any power over me. I was leaving the scared, rejected girl behind forever and walking forward as a woman who commanded her own destiny. The sound of their wailing and screaming grew louder as the shock wore off and the pure panic set in. I could hear Monique starting to shriek at Jerome again, demanding that he fix the situation. I could hear Yvonne, desperate sobbing, echoing down the long hallway. It was the sound of a toxic empire finally burning to the ground. I reached the grand entryway and grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door. I pulled it open, and the crisp, clean outside air immediately washed over my face. It smelled like rain and absolute freedom. I stepped out onto the wide brick porch and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. The thick wood settled into the doorframe with a solid, echoing thud. The latch clicked into place, securely locking the past away. The desperate screaming and the pathetic crying were instantly cut off, leaving me standing in perfect, beautiful silence. I walked down the long driveway toward my waiting car, and I never looked back. 5 days had passed since I walked out of that house for the absolute last time. 5 days since the fragile illusion of my parents' perfect life completely shattered and crumbled into dust. I sat outside on the expansive private balcony of my downtown Atlanta penthouse, letting the warm evening breeze wash over me. The massive city skyline stretched out in front of me, a brilliant sea of glowing lights and endless possibilities. I leaned back into my comfortable lounge chair and held a glass of incredibly expensive red wine in my hand. For the first time in my entire existence, my mind was entirely quiet. There was no lingering anxiety in my chest, and no desperate inner voice demanding validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. My legal team and my private investigators had kept me thoroughly updated on the immediate fallout. I did not have to lift a single finger to watch the destruction unfold. I simply read the daily reports detailing the rapid, miserable collapse of their precious empire. The eviction order had been executed with absolute ruthless efficiency. Jerome and Yvonne were given exactly 48 hours to vacate the property, and they spent every single second of that time drowning in absolute public humiliation. My investigators sent me photographs of cheap local movers hauling my parents' remaining possessions out of the grand estate. The massive front doors were propped open, while strangers carried out whatever clothing and basic furniture they could salvage. The absolute worst part for Yvonne was not losing the house, but rather the undeniable reality of her neighbors watching the entire spectacle. I read reports of the local country club members driving slowly past the estate, witnessing the mighty Jerome and his flawless wife loading their lives into a rented moving truck. Jerome did not yell or try to command the movers. He simply stood on the sidewalk looking completely defeated and hollow while the empire he built on lies was officially legally repossessed. Monique's reality was arguably even worse. The golden child who had spent her entire life expecting the world to be handed to her on a silver platter was currently facing the absolute darkest chapter of her existence. My investigators sent me updates on her whereabouts. She had spent the last 3 days standing outside the local county jail, crying hysterically into her phone while waiting for visitation hours. Trevor had been formally indicted on multiple counts of massive federal wire fraud and identity theft. The prosecution had an airtight case against him, and the federal judge denied him bail, considering him a severe flight risk. Trevor was currently facing 15 years in federal prison. Monique was completely alone. She had no money, no marketable skills, and a husband who would be spending the next decade and a half locked in a federal penitentiary. The luxurious life she thought she had secured by marrying a smooth-talking con artist had evaporated, leaving her with absolutely nothing. I took a slow sip of my red wine and let the rich flavor settle on my tongue. My phone sat quietly on the sleek glass patio table next to me. The screen had been lighting up constantly for the past 48 hours. I leaned forward and tapped the dark screen, watching it illuminate the evening darkness. The notification center displayed exactly 146 missed calls. Every single one of them was from Yvonne. There were dozens of frantic, rambling voicemails and endless streams of text messages pleading for me to answer. She had spent the last 2 days obsessively dialing my number, desperately hoping I would pick up and magically save her from the horrific reality of her new life. She was completely out of options, and her golden child was in no position to rescue her. As I stared at the glowing screen, the phone suddenly started vibrating against the glass table. It was ringing for the 147th time. The name Yvonne flashed brightly across the display. I looked at the name for a long moment, feeling absolutely no obligation and no residual guilt. I slowly reached out, picked up the phone, and pressed the green button to accept the call. I brought the device to my ear, but I did not say a single word. Aaliyah. The voice on the other end shrieked instantly. "Oh my God, Aaliyah, are you there? Please tell me you are there." Yvonne's voice was completely unrecognizable. It was a hysterical, broken mess of pathetic weeping and gasping breaths. She sounded like a drowning woman desperately clawing for a life raft. I remained perfectly silent, listening to the frantic sound of her hyperventilating on the other end of the line. "Please, baby, please! You have to talk to me!" she begged, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. "I am so sorry, Aaliyah. I am so incredibly sorry for everything. We were wrong about Trevor, and we were wrong about you. I will do anything you want me to do. I will change. I promise I will be the mother you always wanted me to be. Just please talk to me." I stared out at the beautiful glowing skyline and took another leisurely sip of my wine. Her apologies meant absolutely nothing to me. They were not born out of genuine remorse or maternal love. They were born entirely out of desperate poverty. She was only apologizing because she was currently sitting in some cramped, cheap apartment, staring at a completely empty bank account. "Aaliyah, please answer me," she wailed loudly, the sound of her crying echoing through the speaker. "We have absolutely nothing left. We do not know how we are going to survive. You have to help us. Please, Aaliyah, we are your family." The word family sounded incredibly strange coming from her mouth. It was a concept they had weaponized and twisted to serve their own selfish needs my entire life. I lowered my wine glass and finally broke my silence. My voice was calm, measured, and completely empty of any emotional attachment. "You told me failures do not belong in our family, Mom," I said quietly, echoing the exact cruel words she had used to dismiss me years ago. "I guess you were right. Have a nice life." Before she could scream or beg or offer another pathetic false apology, I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button. The call ended with a sharp, definitive click. I immediately went into my settings and blocked her number. I then went into my contacts and permanently deleted her from my phone. I did the exact same thing for Jerome and Monique. They were entirely erased from my digital life, just as they were erased from my actual life. I set the phone face down on the glass table and picked up my silver laptop. I opened the screen and navigated to my corporate email. Sitting at the very top of my inbox was a message from my primary real estate development contractor. The email contained the final official demolition order for the old estate. It simply required my digital signature to proceed. I looked at the attached document outlining the complete physical destruction of the house that had held so much pain and misery. I moved my cursor over the approval button and clicked it without a single second of hesitation. The authorization sent instantly, setting the final stage of my victory into motion. By the end of the week, the massive columns and the perfectly manicured hedges would be reduced to a pile of shattered debris, clearing the way for something entirely new and incredibly profitable. I closed the laptop and leaned back into my chair, looking up at the clear night sky above the sprawling city. I let out a long, slow breath, and a genuine bright smile spread across my face. I was completely at peace. The greatest lesson here is that blood does not automatically make someone family. Loyalty should never require accepting abuse. Aaliyah sought validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. She finally realized her true worth was defined by her own resilience, not their cruel expectations. Walking away from toxic relatives is not an act of failure, but an act of profound self-respect. You simply cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace? Share your story below and please subscribe today.